Have you ever seen international movie posters and box art and wondered why the US gets the bland and samey version? Maybe you've seen an ad for something on TV only to find out that another country's ad was a lot more entertaining. Maybe you've even wondered why the Sega Saturn had an amazing series of ads in Japan that the US doesn't know about. Today I want to show you the Segata Sanshiro ads that never made it to the US and answer why we never got them.
遊びの道に魂込めた一人の男が今日も行く真面目に遊ばぬ奴らには体で覚えさせるぞセガタ三四郎セガタ三四郎セガサタンシロとや
These ads feature Segata Sanshiro, a martial artist who commands people to play the Sega Saturn. Literally. This man beats up on child and adult alike to get the point across. You are not allowed a social life. You must play the Sega Saturn. He is both feared and respected by all. These commercials are awesome, but what do they mean? Who is this man? Well, the character is actually a parody from Japanese pop culture. Sanshiro Segata was the directorial debut of Japanese film auteur Akira Kurosawa, based on the novel of the same name. Released theatrically in March of 1943, the story follows the eponymous Sanshiro, a willful youth traveling to the city in order to learn jujitsu, but upon his arrival, he discovers a new and more spiritual form of self-defense in judo. In struggling to learn the meaning and nuance of judo from his mentor Yano, he comes to learn the meaning of satori, and the calm acceptance of nature's law. The film utilizes many of the conventions typical of martial arts media. The rival schools with the good master and the bad master is seen in The Karate Kid, the secret techniques in judo and jujitsu, and the idea that the apprentice must not only learn how to conduct himself in combat, but also in every aspect of their life. Akira Kurosawa would go on to direct many important films, notably The Seven Samurai, Rashomon, Yojimbo, and The Hidden Fortress, which served as a major inspiration to one of the biggest franchises in the world. His reputation amongst filmmakers is of international admiration, and he left behind a legacy of celebrated films and techniques still used today. Let's fast forward half a century to the year of 1994.
Roaring Star!
The Sega Genesis is a huge success due to brilliant advertising from Sega, challenging Nintendo's prowess over the video game market and introducing the world to Sonic the Hedgehog. Yet not everything was so perfect at Sega. Disagreements between Sega of Japan and Sega of America ultimately led to an unsuccessful relationship within the company leading up to the launch of Sega's next console venture, the Saturn. Sega of America's then president Tom Kalinske was concerned about the Saturn's specs. Two companies offered to help resolve this issue. Silicon Graphics founder Jim Clark presented Sega with their new energy-efficient chipset, but when Kalinske presented the chips to Sega of Japan, they ultimately rejected the offer due to the size and cost of the chips. Kalinske appreciated the work that had gone into the chipset and suggested that they approach Nintendo instead. Nintendo accepted the offer and would use SGI technology toward the development of the Nintendo 64. Sony also approached Sega to collaborate on a disc-based system. Tom Kalinske and Sony's Ken Kutagari were enthusiastic about the idea, but were dismissed by president of Sega Enterprises Hayao Nakayama. Sony would go on to enter the console race themselves with the PlayStation set to release December of 1994. This was horrible for Sega, who had anticipated a late 1994 launch window all to themselves. The PlayStation's graphics were enough to make Sega anxious about their specs and led to Nakayama demanding a second CPU be added to the console to boost its 2D and 3D capabilities. However, the dual processors made the Saturn difficult to develop for, and the intended release date looked unlikely. At CES 1994, a group of Sega employees were invited to a conference call with Nakayama, who demanded an immediate response to the Atari Jaguar, which was being touted around as the first 64-bit console in a 16-bit market. With the Sega Genesis still doing well in America, and delays for the Saturn looking more and more likely, Sega created the 32X add-on designed to expand the power of the Genesis and serve as a low-cost transition into the 32-bit era and boasting its own library of games. The decision to make an upgrade for the Genesis only hampered its launch, however, as the 32X launched the same month in the West. Consumers wondered why they should buy a 32X if the Saturn's launch was imminent. Developers also had to decide whether to develop for the add-on or for the Saturn. On top of that, Sega of Japan mandated an early launch in America to get an advantage over the PlayStation. Due to the early launch, the Saturn only had 6 games that launched, all published by Sega, and Virtua Fighter's relative unpopularity in the West squandered the Saturn's early launch. The Saturn would fade into relative obscurity in the West despite a praised library of games. In Japan, however, the Saturn had a successful launch, selling out of their initial 200,000 units on the first day and waiting until the PlayStation launched the following months to ship more units, and proved to be the more popular console, selling 500,000 Saturns versus Sony's 300,000 PlayStation units after the holiday season. But by 1995, Sony began to overtake Sega in sales, and that's where Segata Sanshiro came in.
Segata Sanshiro, Segata Sanshiro, Segata Sanshiro.
Summer 1997. The Sega Saturn had been out for over 2 years, and the PlayStation is winning a decisive battle over the Saturn. The marketing team for Sega put their heads together to create a new face to represent the Saturn to take down their competitor. Previously, we've seen Sega bully the competition, but now we see them bullying children. Allow me to introduce to you Sanshiro Segata, based on the previously mentioned Sanshiro Sugata. Hiroshi Fujioka, famous for starring in Kamen Rider and skilled martial artist, was selected to play the role because of his vague resemblance to Segata actor Susumu Fujita. He accepted because he liked the idea of the character and thought Segata would send a strong message to children. And he did. Maybe too strong a message. The commercials ran all the way until the end of the Saturn's life in 1998, when Sega's next and final console was set to release, the Dreamcast. Indeed, we see the character Segata Sanshiro's transformation into world hero as the final commercial features him saving Sega Company Limited from a nuclear weapon, sacrificing himself in the process. Segata Sanshiro left behind a legacy of Saturn's successful run in Japan, beating out the mighty Nintendo 64. But even if we got Segata Sanshiro in the US, would it have saved the Sega Saturn? Maybe. After all, I don't think the Sanshiro Segata parody obvious to a Japanese market would hamper the character too much. Everyone I've shown these ads to think the character is funny on his own. But then who was the spokesperson for the Sega Saturn in the US?
Introducing Sega Saturn. Aww, hit it!
Maybe Sega was doomed from the very beginning. Anyway, here's hoping we get more Segata Sanshiro in the future.
And arcade gameplay, all with amazing new 3D experiences never before possible on home game systems.